The alert came through on a secure channel, a digital whisper on a forum frequented by park rangers and backcountry professionals. It was flagged with a simple, innocuous tag: Unusual Predation, Iron Ridge National Park, Montana. Most would scroll past it, another grim reminder of nature's indifference. I didn't. I opened the file, and the world outside my quiet Oregon home fell away. The attached photos were grainy, taken on a ranger's phone in the flat, gray light of a Montana dawn, but they were clear enough. An adult bull moose, well over 1,000 pounds of muscle and fury, lay broken in a clearing of Douglas fir. Its antlers were tangled in the underbrush, one leg bent at an angle that defied biology. But it was the torso that held my attention, that made the coffee in my stomach turn to acid. The rib cage had been shattered and bent outwards, peeled back like the husk of some grotesque fruit. The vast cavity within was mostly empty, the organs exposed to the freezing air. The report noted that very little of the meat had been consumed. The heart and liver were gone, sliced out, not torn, not ripped, but excised with a horrifying precision that no bear or mountain lion could ever manage. The report called it anomalous. The journal, my ancestors' leather-bound burden, called it a harvest. Sheriff Warren Croft stood over the carcass, the steam from his breath mingling with the cold mist rising from the dead animal. He was a man carved from the Montana landscape itself, weathered, solid, and deeply pragmatic. He'd seen what grizzlies could do. He'd seen what happened when a semi-truck hit a deer at 70 miles an hour. This was different, and the difference made the hairs on his arms stand up under his thick flannel jacket. "Looks like a big grizz got spooked mid-meal," his deputy, a kid barely out of his 20s, offered. Croft nudged a splintered rib with the toe of his boot. The bone was as thick as his wrist. "A grizz big enough to do this wouldn't get spooked by anything short of a freight train," he said, his voice a low rumble. Still, he had a town to think about. Tourist season was just around the corner. Panic was a more dangerous predator than any bear. Log it as a grizzly kill, territorial dispute. Put out a general warning for hikers on the Iron Ridge trails. Tell them to carry bear spray and make some noise. He didn't believe his own words, not entirely. The clean emptiness of the animal's chest felt wrong. It felt personal. Back in Oregon, I was already moving. The journal's encrypted entries, a lifetime of my family's secret war, cross-referenced the location and the specific method of kill. Iron Ridge, copper mines, weakened earth. The harvest begins with the heart of the sovereign, the liver of the strong. They were gathering components, building something, preparing. My kit was in a reinforced pelican case under the floorboards in my study. It wasn't a collection of hobbies, it was a set of surgical tools for a very specific kind of cancer. The Weatherby Mark IV rifle, its synthetic stock worn smooth from my grip, was the centerpiece. Its action was clean, the trigger pull a crisp 2 pounds. Beside it, in partitioned foam cutouts, were boxes of ammunition. The cartridges were .300 Weatherby Magnum, but the projectiles were my own work. I cast them myself in the garage from silver medallions and heirlooms, melted down and mixed with a trace of mercury. Each one was a tiny, purpose-built ghost. Alongside the rifle were an assortment of older, stranger tools: forged iron stakes, vials of wolfsbane concentrate, and a set of custom-machined ultraviolet projectors. I loaded the case into my F-150, the truck's unassuming gray paint and stock wheels a deliberate choice for anonymity. Then I started driving east. Arrowwood, Montana, was exactly the kind of town you'd expect to find nestled in the shadow of a national park. A single main street with a diner, a general store, a sheriff's office, and a bar. When I pushed open the door to the diner, the bell above it jangled, and every conversation stopped. Every head turned. I was a stranger in a town where there were no strangers, only locals and brightly colored tourists. I was neither. My face, with the faded white scar tracing a line down from my temple, and my eyes, which have a habit of taking in a room too quickly, marked me as something else. I took a seat at the counter, ordered a black coffee, and listened. Told my brother-in-law to stay out of the North Range for a while. A man in a John Deere hat was saying, "Sheriff says it's a grizzly gone mean, but I ain't never heard of a grizz pulling a moose apart like that." "It's the wolves," another man grumbled. "Government brought 'em back, and now look. Getting bold, they were scared. They were guessing. They were lambs trying to identify the shadow in the distance, calling it a coyote when the truth was far, far worse." I paid for the coffee and walked across the street to the sheriff's office. The building smelled of stale coffee and gun oil. Sheriff Croft was at his desk, staring at the same photos I'd seen online. He looked up as I entered. His eyes narrowed with the practiced suspicion of a man who'd spent 30 years dealing with the worst parts of human nature. "Can I help you?" he asked. "My name is Spencer Wyatt. I'm here about the moose." "It was a bear," he said flatly, a statement meant to end the conversation. "No, it wasn't," I replied, keeping my voice level. I knew better than to mention monsters. You don't tell a man like Croft the world is haunted. You give him a threat he can understand. I've tracked groups like this before. They're poachers, but not for trophies. It's ritualistic. They're highly organized, they're dangerous, and what they did to that moose is a prelude. They're not just a threat to your wildlife, Sheriff. They're a threat to your town. Croft leaned back in his chair, studying me. He saw my posture, the way I stood without fidgeting, the way my gaze didn't waver. He probably saw a federal agent, maybe Bureau of Land Management, or even a spook from some three-letter agency. Or worse, a militia nutcase looking for a fight. "Mr. Wyatt, I appreciate your concern," he said, his tone polite but firm as granite. "But we have the situation under control. I'd advise you not to go wandering around the park. For your own safety." It was a dismissal. He turned to his young deputy. "Jimmy, run a background check on a Spencer Wyatt." Full workup, I gave a slight nod. I had expected as much. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff." He didn't answer. I walked out into the cold Montana air, the conversation replaying in my mind. He hadn't believed me. He wouldn't help. I was alone. Back in my motel room, a clean, anonymous box smelling of pine-scented cleaner, I unrolled a topographical map of Iron Ridge National Park across the cheap bedspread. The journal of my ancestor lay open beside it. His spidery script, written over a century ago, described the layout of the old copper mines in the northern range with chilling accuracy. "The veins of copper act as conduits," he wrote. "They draw power from the earth, and in places the veil between worlds is thin." I found the cluster of abandoned mines on the map, marked with the small crossed pickaxe symbol. With a pencil, I drew a circle around them. The journal called it the Terra Infirma, the weakened land, the nest. At dawn, I would go hunting. The air at 5,000 feet had a razor's edge. Dawn was a smear of bruised purple and blood orange across the eastern peaks as I left the F-150 parked in a deserted turnout, miles from any official trailhead. Dressed in layers of earth-toned, durable synthetics, I melted into the landscape. This wasn't a hike. It was an infiltration. I moved with the economy of a soldier, my eyes constantly scanning, my feet finding purchase on loose shale and damp earth with practiced silence. The wind howled through the canyons, a lonely, predatory sound that seemed to scour the very rock. I ignored the marked trails, the paths worn smooth by tourists and their good intentions. My route was dictated by the land itself, following game trails and creek beds, pushing through thickets of lodgepole pine that grabbed at my clothes like skeletal hands. My attention was fixed on the anomalies, the things that didn't belong. 20 minutes in, I found the first one. A series of deep, parallel gouges in a granite rock face, 12 feet off the ground. No bear could reach that high and claw with such force. The marks were clean, powerful, as if something had used the rock to sharpen blades of steel. Further on, I found a hemlock branch, thick as my thigh, snapped clean off 8 feet up, not broken by wind or rot, but sheared by a massive, violent force moving through the woods too fast to care. Then came the tracks. They were faint on the hard-packed dirt and pine needles, but unmistakable. Too large for a wolf, the gait too long. They were heavy, purposeful. The tracks of a bipedal creature trying to mimic the four-legged stride of an animal and failing. They were leading me straight toward the old copper mines. At the mouth of an abandoned shaft, its entrance choked with rust-colored scree, I found the second offering. A full-grown male cougar, its tawny hide matted with dark, drying blood. The scene was an echo of the moose, a brutal refrain in this wilderness symphony of death. The cat's chest was torn open, the ribs splayed wide. Its heart and liver were gone. I knelt, my gloved fingers tracing the edge of the wound. A clean cut. They were collecting the essence of the apex predators, the spirits of this mountain range. The moose was the king, the embodiment of endurance and strength. The cougar was the ghost, the master of stealth, and the silent kill. They weren't just killing. They were building a god. Back in Arrowwood, Sheriff Croft stared at the file his deputy had placed on his desk. The background check on Spencer Wyatt was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. Nothing criminal. Honorable discharge from the army. Served multiple tours in Afghanistan as a scout sniper. His record was heavily decorated, but the final entry was redacted, citing a classified incident that led to his discharge. He currently owned a parcel of inherited property in rural Oregon. No family, no attachments. It painted a picture of a man who was highly skilled, isolated, and possibly unstable. A ghost. Croft's instinct, honed over decades, told him this man wasn't a random drifter. His arrival, timed perfectly with the dead moose, felt like the first tremor before an earthquake. I followed the trail of subtle signs. A dislodged rock here, a patch of unnaturally flattened grass there, to a section of the ridge that looked like nothing more than a solid wall of rock and overgrown brush. But my eyes, trained to see patterns in chaos, picked out the faint outline of a concealed entrance. A heavy thicket of thorny bushes had been deliberately pulled across a fissure in the rock face. I pushed it aside, the thorns tearing at my jacket. The air that washed over me from the opening was stale, cold, and thick with the metallic tang of old blood and damp earth. This was it. I unslung my rifle, thumbing the safety off, and clicked on the tactical flashlight mounted beneath the barrel. The beam cut a sharp white cone into the oppressive darkness. The tunnel was man-made, shored up with rotting timbers every few feet. Water dripped from the ceiling, each drop echoing like a ticking clock in the profound silence. The floor was littered with debris, but among the rocks and dirt, I saw them. Bones. Hundreds of them, mostly animal, splintered and gnawed. The main tunnel opened into a larger chamber, a junction where several shafts converged. In the center, sitting on the rusted tracks, was an old ore cart. What I saw on and around it made me freeze. The cold dread of physical weight in my gut. It was a totem, a monument to butchery. Skulls, dozens and dozens of them, piled in a macabre pyramid on the cart, spilling onto the floor around it. I saw the massive skulls of bull moose and grizzly bears, the smaller, leaner skulls of wolves and deer, the delicate skulls of coyotes. They were all there, a silent congregation of the vanquished. And then I saw the others. Tucked within the pile, almost hidden, were human skulls. At least 5 of them, yellowed and darkened with age, some bearing the unmistakable fracture lines of extreme violence. One had a small, round hole in the forehead. My breath hitched. My working theory had been a small pack. Maybe a handful of ferals living on the fringe. I was wrong. Horribly wrong. This wasn't a den. It was a charnel house. This wasn't a hunting party. It was a dynasty. The age of the human skulls told a story of decades, perhaps even a century, of unchallenged dominion. They had been here for generations, culling the wildlife, taking human victims when they pleased, all while the town of Arrowwood slumbered peacefully below. The ritual wasn't a new development. It was an apotheosis, the culmination of a long and bloody reign. Their ambition wasn't just survival. It was ascension. And I had just walked into the heart of their cathedral. The hum of the motel's ancient air conditioner was the only sound in the room, a low thrum against the backdrop of a vast, silent night. The horror of the bone totem in the mine hadn't sparked fear in me, but a cold, clarifying anger. My initial assessment had been a catastrophic miscalculation. A frontal assault on a nest that large, that established, would be suicide. My strategy had to change. I wasn't here to exterminate a nest of rats. I was here to dismantle a monarchy. And you don't start with the king. You start by picking off his knights. My new plan was simple: thin the herd. I would use their own arrogance, their own predatory instincts against them. The young ones, the bucks full of piss and vinegar, would be the first to go. I would wound the pack, make it bleed, and draw the larger threat into a fight on my terms. For the next 2 days, I became a ghost in Iron Ridge National Park. I didn't hunt them. I prepared a battlefield. Using my military experience, I turned a quarter-mile stretch of the dense forest leading to their hidden mine entrance into a death trap. I worked methodically, leaving no trace of my presence. In the narrow game trails, I set up tripwires, not with explosives, but with spools of silver alloy monofilament line, stretched taut at ankle height. It wouldn't kill them, but it would slice through flesh and sinew, crippling them. In a small clearing directly in front of the concealed entrance, I spent hours digging. I excavated 2 pits, each 6 feet deep, lining the bottom with sharpened rebar stakes that I had coated in a molten silver compound. I covered the pits with a delicate lattice of branches and a blanket of leaves and pine needles, indistinguishable from the surrounding forest floor. They were classic tiger traps, simple but brutally effective. My masterstroke was the lighting. I hauled 3 heavy-duty truck batteries and 3 powerful, custom-built ultraviolet floodlights into the woods. I positioned them in the trees overlooking the clearing, wired to a pressure plate I buried in the center of the area. UVA light at this intensity was like acid to their kind. It wouldn't kill them instantly, but the burns would be agonizing, disorienting. It would turn their greatest asset, their inhuman speed and strength, into a liability as they writhed in pain. For the final piece, the bait, I drove into the next county and found a local butcher who supplied wild game to restaurants. I bought a fresh deer liver, still warm. Back at the staging area, I placed the liver on the pressure plate in the center of the clearing. Then, I pulled a hunting knife from my boot, pushed up the sleeve of my jacket, and drew a shallow cut across my forearm. I let a few drops of my own blood drip onto the liver. The smell of a fresh kill was an invitation. The smell of human blood mixed with it was an insult, a challenge. It was a territorial marking that the younger, more aggressive members of the pack would feel compelled to answer. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised plum, I settled into my sniper's nest. I'd found a rocky outcrop 150 yards from the clearing, a perfect vantage point with a clear line of sight and a solid escape route. I lay prone on the cold stone, wrapped in a camouflage ghillie blanket that broke up my outline, becoming just another rock in the twilight. My Weatherby was snug against my shoulder, the scope's crosshairs centered on the bait. My breathing slowed, my heartbeat a steady, patient drum. I was no longer a man. I was an instrument of attrition. Hours passed. The moon rose, a pale sliver in the inky blackness. The forest was alive with the normal sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth. Then, a new sound. A low growl, more felt than heard, from the direction of the mine. A moment later, two figures emerged from the hidden entrance. They weren't walking. They were loping, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that was utterly inhuman. In the low light, I could see their elongated limbs, their hunched postures. They smelled the bait. Their heads snapped up in unison. One of them let out a low, guttural snort and broke into a sprint, the other close behind. They were reckless, charging in without caution, exactly as I'd hoped. The lead creature, bigger than the other, hit the clearing first. Its heavy foot landed squarely on the pressure plate. The world exploded in a silent flash of violent purple light. The UV floodlights blazed to life, bathing the clearing in an otherworldly glow. The creature threw its head back and released a shriek of pure, unadulterated agony. Its skin, where the light touched it, smoked and blistered instantly. It stumbled blindly, clawing at its eyes, its powerful body convulsing. Its companion skidded to a halt at the edge of the clearing, momentarily stunned by the sudden flash and the horrific screams of its packmate. It was confused, its head whipping back and forth trying to locate the source of the attack. That moment of hesitation was all I needed. I exhaled slowly, the crosshairs settling on the center of its chest. I squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against my shoulder, but the sound was swallowed by the suppressor, reduced to a heavy thump. The silver-tipped bullet crossed the 150 yards in an eye blink. It struck the creature dead center. There was no blood. Instead, a brilliant, searing flash of white-blue light erupted from within its chest, as if a star had just been born inside its ribcage. The silver ignited its profane nature. The creature's scream was cut short as its body was consumed from the inside out, collapsing into a heap of blackened, smoldering ash. I worked the bolt on my rifle, the spent casing ejecting with a quiet tink. The first creature was still on the ground, writhing and howling, its form flickering between man and beast under the relentless UV glare. I lined up the shot. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about efficiency. Another suppressed thump. Another flash of internal silver fire. Then silence. Two of them were gone. The bait was untouched. The lights hummed softly in the trees. The message had been delivered. They knew a hunter was among them now. And they knew he was not playing games. The dawn that broke over Iron Ridge was cold and unforgiving. its light revealing the grotesque tableau I had left behind. The Alpha found them there. Or rather, he found what was left of them. 2 patches of scorched earth and blackened, brittle bone, the air still acrid with the smell of silver-burned flesh. There was nothing to bury, nothing to mourn in any human sense. It was a desecration, an insult. To Sterling Graves, it was a declaration of war. In the world of men, Sterling Graves was the picture of success. He owned the largest construction company in the county, building luxury lodges for out-of-state money. He was handsome, charismatic, a pillar of the Arrowwood community, who sat on the town council and donated generously to the annual 4th of July fireworks. His sprawling log-and-glass home, perched on a hillside overlooking the town, was a testament to his power. But his true power lay in his blood. He gathered the remaining 5 members of his pack in the great room of his house. The room, with its vaulted ceilings, stone fireplace, and panoramic windows, felt more like a corporate boardroom than a den. His fury was not the hot, snarling rage of a wild animal. It was the icy, controlled wrath of a king whose authority had been challenged. "A hunter has come to our lands," Graves said, his voice a calm, dangerous baritone. He stood before the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He was in his human form, a tall, impeccably dressed man in his late 40s, with silvering temples and eyes the color of a winter sky. He killed Caleb and Finn. He did not hunt them for sport. He executed them. He used silver and light, the old weapons. He is not some amateur, a younger member of the pack. A man named Reese, who worked as a foreman for Graves's company, paced nervously. "We should fall back. Wait in the mines until he's gone." Graves turned his cold gaze on him, and Reese froze. "Gone? He has defiled our territory. He has murdered our brothers, and you want to hide. We are the apex predators of this valley. For 100 years, the humans in that town below have lived and died at our discretion. They have forgotten fear. They have forgotten their place." He took a slow sip of his whiskey. "This hunter has given us an opportunity to provide a lesson. Tonight we do not hunt in the shadows. We do not pick off a lone hiker. Tonight we descend upon Arrowwood. We will tear down their walls. We will drag them from their homes. We will not just kill them. We will remind them, in blood and screams, what true fear is. We will break their spirit, so that even after we are long gone, they will look to these mountains and tremble. And the hunter, he will see the price for his insolence." Meanwhile, Sheriff Croft's morning had started with a frantic call from Sterling Graves himself, reporting that 2 of his employees, Caleb and Finn, hadn't shown up for work. They'd mentioned going camping up in the park. Croft felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The names meant nothing to him, but the timing, coming a day after his encounter with Spencer Wyatt, was too much for coincidence. He instinctively connected the missing men to the grim-faced stranger. He dispatched his deputy with a patrol car to do a cursory search of the park's public campsites. But he gave a specific order. "Stay the hell away from the old copper mines. Don't even go up that access road." He didn't know why he said it, but the part of his brain that had kept him alive for 60 years was screaming at him. I was back in Arrowwood, moving with a quiet urgency. I knew what was coming. A wounded pack doesn't hide. It lashes out. I spent the day resupplying, buying canisters of propane, road flares, and heavy-duty batteries from the general store, earning a curious look from the clerk. I emptied the local hardware store of their entire stock of rock salt. Back in my motel room, I worked, turning my F-150 into a weapon and preparing for a siege. As evening approached, I made one last attempt. I called the sheriff's office. It went to the answering machine. I left a short, blunt message. "My name is Spencer Wyatt. You have 2 missing men. They're not coming back. Retaliation is coming. Tonight they're coming to town. Be ready." I hung up knowing it was probably useless. Night fell on Arrowwood not as a gentle blanket, but as a suffocating shroud. And then the screaming started. Chaos erupted from 2 sides of the town at once. They didn't use stealth. They came with the force of a natural disaster. A pickup truck parked on Main Street was flipped onto its roof with a deafening screech of tortured metal. The front window of the diner exploded inwards, and a massive dark shape vaulted over the counter. The sounds were a symphony from hell. The guttural roars of the beasts, the splintering of wood, the shattering of glass, and the high, thin screams of human terror. Sheriff Croft and his deputy Jimmy burst out of the office, their service Glocks drawn. They saw a creature, a 9-foot-tall monstrosity of muscle and fur, tearing the door off the general store. Croft fired 3 rounds. The 9mm slugs hit the creature's shoulder with wet thuds, doing little more than making it angrier. It turned, its eyes glowing with malevolent yellow light, and let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the buildings. Panic and death had come to the streets of Arrowwood, and the law was powerless to stop it. The world had devolved into a maelstrom of primal horror. Sheriff Croft and his deputy Jimmy were trapped, having retreated into the town administration building as 2 of the beasts clawed their way through the brick facade. Plaster and dust rained down around them. Croft emptied his Glock into the hulking shape, forcing its way through the wall, the bullets having as much effect as throwing pebbles. Jimmy was trying to reload his shotgun, his hands shaking so badly he could barely thumb the shells into the tube. Everything Croft had ever believed in, the rule of law, the order of society, the simple physics of bullets and bodies, was being shredded before his very eyes along with the wall of his office. The monster's head and shoulders were through now, its jaws snapping, saliva flecked with brick dust. That's when the night erupted in a different kind of violence. Headlights blazed down Main Street, followed by the roar of a V8 engine at full throttle. My Ford F-150, no longer an anonymous pickup but a 4,000-pound battering ram, slammed into the side of a werewolf that was busy dismembering a squad car. The impact was titanic. The creature was thrown 20 feet, its body contorting at an unnatural angle. I didn't slow down. I plowed through the chaos, using the truck's steel bumper to clear a path, forcing the creatures to scatter. I jerked the truck to a halt in front of the administration building and bailed out, not as a hero but as a pest controller with a grim job to do. I wasn't there to have a noble duel. I was there to cull. In my hands was a Kel-Tec KSG shotgun, its twin magazine tubes loaded with 12-gauge shells packed with silver buckshot. Strapped to my thighs were 2 heavily modified handguns. A werewolf, its muzzle dripping with blood, charged me. I didn't aim for the head or the chest. I aimed low. The KSG boomed, the silver pellets shredding the creature's left knee. It went down with a howl of pain and rage, its leg now a useless mangled limb. Another came from my right. I pumped the shotgun and fired again, this time at its hip. The impact spun it around, shattering its pelvic bone. My tactics were brutal and efficient. Maim, cripple, neutralize. Don't get into a wrestling match with a bear. Break its legs from a distance. I created a perimeter of fire and silver, a moving wall of pain that kept the pack at bay, their animal fury turning to confused rage as their bodies failed them. Through the shattered window of the administration building, I saw the scene inside. A massive beast, larger than the others, had finally broken through. It loomed over Croft, who was desperately fumbling for a spare magazine on the floor. Jimmy lay in the corner, his neck bent at a sickening angle. The monster raised a clawed hand, the size of a dinner plate, ready to deliver the final blow to the sheriff. I didn't have a clear shot. Instead, I pulled a small cylinder from my belt pouch. It was an M14 thermite grenade, a military tool for destroying equipment. I pulled the pin, counted to 1, and hurled it through the broken window. It landed on the floor between the monster and Croft. It didn't explode. It ignited. An instantaneous, blindingly brilliant flash of white-hot light filled the office, burning at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The werewolf shrieked, a sound of inhuman agony, as its fur and flesh were seared by the intense heat. It recoiled from the light, blinded and burned, trying to escape the inferno that had suddenly bloomed in the room. The intense light and the acrid chemical smoke were enough. The pack's frenzied assault faltered. From a vantage point on the hill above town, Sterling Graves watched the chaos. He saw the single truck, the methodical, crippling shots, the incendiary device. This wasn't a panicked citizen. This was the hunter. He had underestimated him. The hunter had turned his lesson in terror back on him, disrupting the raid, robbing it of its momentum. With a low growl that carried on the wind, a command that his packmates understood on a primal level, Graves gave the signal to withdraw. The lesson was over, for now. One by one, the hulking shapes disengaged, melting back into the darkness of the national park, leaving behind a street littered with wreckage, fire, and the dead. I stalked into the smoke-filled office, the KSG held at the ready. Croft was on his knees, coughing, his face pale with shock and grief, his eyes fixed on the still form of his deputy. He looked up at me, his gaze traveling from my weapon to my face, to the smoldering grenade on the floor. The world he knew was in ruins around him. "You," he rasped, his voice raw. "You knew." I racked a new shell into the shotgun's chamber, the shuck-shuck sound echoing in the destroyed room. I gave him a single, grim nod. "This was just them testing the fences," I said, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The main event is in 2 days, on the night of the lunar eclipse. They're not done with your town. They've just begun." Dawn revealed a town that looked like it had been hit by a tornado with a malicious intelligence. The rising sun cast long, somber shadows over overturned vehicles, shattered storefronts, and dark stains on the pavement that everyone tried not to look at too closely. The phone lines were dead, the cell tower on the edge of town apparently disabled. Arrowwood was an island, isolated by geography and by an act of unimaginable violence. Sheriff Croft, his face a mask of grim exhaustion, moved with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man carrying the world on his shoulders. He gathered the town's small volunteer fire department and a few other key figures. Using the authority that was all he had left, he declared a state of emergency. The official story, broadcast over a battery-powered radio, was a freak gas line explosion, followed by a rampage from a pack of bears driven mad by the blast. It was a flimsy lie, but it was better than the truth. It was a story that would keep the outside world at bay, just for a little while. He needed time. We met in what was left of his office. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and thermite. I'd unrolled my topographical map over his desk, which was covered in a fine layer of dust and broken glass. I opened my ancestor's journal to a marked page. "They're not just monsters, Croft," I began, my voice low. "There's a hierarchy, a purpose. The one leading them, the Alpha, is Sterling Graves." Croft's head snapped up. "Graves? That's insane. He runs half the businesses in this county. He reported 2 of his own men missing." "The 2 men I killed," I corrected him. "It's the perfect cover. The monster hiding in plain sight. But he's planning something more than a simple massacre. This journal describes it. It's a ritual." I pointed to a diagram on the journal's yellowed page. A circle, astronomical symbols, and lines of archaic text. "In 2 days there's a total lunar eclipse. A blood moon. Graves has been harvesting components. The hearts and livers of the region's apex predators. The moose, the cougar. He's collecting their spiritual essence. The ritual combines 3 things. The power of the land's guardian spirits, the celestial energy of the eclipse as a conductor, and a place of power." I tapped the circle I had drawn on the map. "The copper mines. The journal calls it a place where the earth is weak." "A ritual for what?" Croft asked, his voice barely a whisper. "To become a god. Or something close to it. But it's worse than that. The ritual won't just empower him. It's designed to release a wave of primal energy. The journal calls it the unfurling. It will forcibly awaken the dormant lycanthropic gene in anyone with a latent bloodline. There could be dozens of people in this region, in this very town, who have no idea what they are. Men and women who will suddenly violently transform. Graves won't just have a pack. He'll have an army." Croft stared at the map, then at the journal, then out the broken window at his ravaged town. He looked at the corner where Jimmy's body had been. The hard shell of his skepticism, already fractured, finally shattered completely. He looked back at me, and for the first time, he wasn't looking at a lunatic or a federal agent. He was looking at a surgeon who had just diagnosed a terminal cancer and was holding the only scalpel that might cut it out. "What do you need?" he asked, his voice rough with grief and newfound resolve. "Guns," I said, "and silver." He led me to the evidence locker in the basement. It was a small, steel-caged room filled with the accumulated sins of Arrowwood. He unlocked a large cabinet labeled confiscated firearms. Inside was an arsenal of hunting rifles, shotguns, and a few semi-automatic rifles taken from doomsday preppers over the years. I immediately went for an AR-10 and a couple of M1A rifles, along with every box of .308 ammunition he had. The silver was a bigger problem. There wasn't any. Then Croft's eyes lit up. He went to a different locker and pulled out a dusty box filled with old evidence bags. Inside were tarnished silver dollars, old jewelry, and antique silverware from a string of burglaries in the 90s. Will this work? We set up a crude foundry in the back lot of the sheriff's department, using a propane-fueled turkey fryer and a small crucible. I showed Croft and the 2 deputies he still trusted how to do it. We pulled the lead tips from the 309 rifle cartridges with pliers. We melted down the tarnished silver heirlooms, the metal glowing like liquid moonlight in the crucible. Then, with painstaking care, we poured the molten silver into the hollowed-out tips of the bullets, creating dozens of custom-made silver core rounds. The work was grim, silent, a funereal rite for a battle yet to come. As we worked, I laid out the plan. It was desperate. A Hail Mary. We can't fight an army. We have to cut the head off the snake. We hit the nest during the ritual. He'll be in the middle of his transformation, channeling immense power. That's when he'll be at his most powerful, but also his most vulnerable. We get one shot at this. Croft looked at the handful of silver-tipped bullets cooling on a metal tray. This is a one-way trip, isn't it, Wyatt? I didn't look up from the bullet I was crimping. It always is. Croft was a man transformed. The pragmatic by-the-book sheriff was gone, replaced by a field commander preparing for an impossible battle. He gathered a small, hand-picked group of men in the town hall's basement. They were former military, old-timers who'd hunted these mountains their whole lives, men he knew he could trust with his life. He didn't tell them the truth. He couldn't. He fed them the official story I'd helped him craft. The town had been attacked by a heavily armed, drug-fueled, doomsday cult calling themselves the Children of Fenris, who were holed up in the old mines. The attack we were planning was a preemptive strike to take out their leadership before they could finish whatever bomb they were building. The story was just plausible enough to work. He saw the grim acceptance in their eyes. They didn't need to know about monsters. They just needed an enemy to fight for their ruined homes. That night, the last night before the eclipse, the silence in Arrowwood was heavier than any sound. I sat on the edge of the bed in my motel room, the tools of my trade laid out before me. I wasn't cleaning my rifle or prepping gear. I was holding a single worn dog tag in my hand. It didn't belong to me. It belonged to Sergeant Mike Rivera, my spotter in Afghanistan. The man who had bled out in my arms after we stumbled into something in a remote mountain cave that wasn't on any intelligence briefing. The incident that ended my career and started my war. For a moment, the iron wall of my composure cracked. The fatigue of this endless secret fight washed over me, a weariness that went bone deep. I wasn't just tired of fighting. I was tired of being the only one who knew what the fight was really about. A soft knock came at the door. It was Croft. He didn't say anything, just came in and sat in the room's only other chair. He held a bottle of whiskey and 2 plastic cups. He poured 2 fingers in each and handed one to me. We sat in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the clink of ice in the cups. "My deputy." "Jimmy," Croft finally said, his voice thick. He stared into his cup. He was 22. Was going to get married this fall to his high school sweetheart. Good kid. Was going to take over from me one day. He took a long swallow of the whiskey and looked at me, his eyes burning with a cold fire I recognized all too well. "When you get to graves, burn them all to the ground, Wyatt." "That's the plan," I said. After he left, I prepared my last resort. It was a Ruger Super Red Hawk revolver, a cannon of a handgun chambered in 4.54 Casol. It was too big, too heavy, a ridiculous weapon for any practical purpose, but it served one. I slid a single, custom-made cartridge into the cylinder. The bullet was a masterpiece of lethal engineering I had spent years perfecting. A jacket of hand-engraved silver, a core of solidified mercury, and at its heart, a sliver of wolfsbane root harvested under a full moon and blessed by a priest who owed my family a debt. It was a weapon of myth, designed to kill a god. I loaded the single round, snapped the cylinder shut, and slid the massive revolver into a concealed holster at the small of my back. As the sun began to set, the sky took on an eerie, sickly orange hue. The moon rose preternaturally large and bright, but a sliver of darkness was already beginning to consume its edge. The eclipse had begun. A sound drifted down from the mountains, a low, drawn-out howl that was picked up by others, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with a multi-species chorus of predatory hunger. It was time. Croft's patrol truck, its light bar removed and its body spattered with mud, tore up the unpaved, winding road toward the mines. The headlights cut a frantic path through the oppressive darkness. I was in the passenger seat, the AR-10 across my lap. We saw them in the trees, Swift, dark shapes pacing the truck, their eyes reflecting the headlights like hot coals. They were escorting us, herding us toward the slaughter. Up ahead, the road was blocked. 3 of them stood there, their massive forms silhouetted against the rising moon. They weren't moving, just waiting. A welcoming committee. "Don't slow down," I said calmly. Croft gritted his teeth and pushed the accelerator to the floor. The truck's engine screamed in protest. He aimed for the one in the middle. There was a sickening, crunching thud as several 100 pounds of monster and a ton of Detroit steel collided. The werewolf was thrown aside like a rag doll. As we blew past them, I leaned out the window and fired 2 precise semi-automatic shots. 2 booms, 2 flashes of internal silver fire. The other 2 figures collapsed into heaps of ash. The road ahead was clear. We abandoned the truck at the end of the road and plunged into the gaping mouth of the mine. The darkness inside was absolute, a physical presence that swallowed the light and deadened sound. The air was a suffocating cocktail of metallic blood, wet rock, and a strange electric charge that made the fillings in my teeth ache. From the depths below, we could hear it, a low, rhythmic chanting, a guttural hum that vibrated up through the soles of our boots. The ritual had begun. I took point, my flashlight's beam cutting a nervous swath through the gloom. Croft followed close behind, his shotgun held at the ready. We moved down the main adit, the wooden support beams overhead groaning under the weight of the mountain. Every drip of water, every skittering rock sounded like an approaching enemy. We were 100 yards in when it happened. I swept the beam across a side tunnel just as a blur of motion exploded from the darkness. It was on us in a heartbeat, a whirlwind of claws and teeth. There was no time to aim. Croft reacted on pure instinct, shoving the barrel of his shotgun forward and pulling the trigger. The roar of the blast was deafening in the confined space. The beast, caught mid-lunge, was hammered backward by the force of the buckshot, slamming into the rock wall with a wet crunch. Before it could recover, I put a single silver core round from the AR-10 through its skull. It collapsed, twitching, then went still. We stood there for a second, our ears ringing, chests heaving. The element of surprise was gone. They knew we were here. The chanting from below grew louder, more frantic. "We're never going to make it to the main chamber like this," Croft said, his voice strained. "They'll pick us off one by one in these tunnels." He looked down a narrow, intersecting shaft, then at the small satchel of explosives his men had given him, confiscated mining dynamite. An idea, desperate and grim, formed on his face. "I can create a diversion," he said, his voice firm. "I'll set a charge in this side tunnel. The collapse will draw most of them. It'll buy you time to get to Graves." "That's a suicide mission, Sheriff." He gave me a hard, tired smile. "I'm 61 years old, Wyatt. My town is in ruins and my best deputy is dead. My life ended last night. This is just settling a debt." He began wedging the dynamite sticks into a fissure in the rock. "See you on the other side." He set the timer, his movements practiced and calm. "You've got 30 seconds. Go." I didn't argue. I didn't have time. I just nodded once, turned, and ran. I sprinted down the main tunnel, plunging deeper into the earth, counting the seconds in my head. I was a dozen paces past the intersection when the world behind me tore itself apart. A concussive roar ripped through the mine, the shockwave nearly knocking me off my feet. The ground shuddered violently, and the air filled with a choking cloud of rock dust. I heard the splintering of ancient timbers and the deep groan of a mountain being wounded. Behind me, I heard Croft open fire with his shotgun, his defiant shouts echoing above the chaos, drawing the pack's fury toward the sound of the collapse. He was a lone lighthouse in a sea of monsters, buying me the most precious commodity in the world, a few more seconds of life. While the pack swarmed toward the sound of the explosion and gunfire, I ran, my legs pumping, my lungs burning. The rhythmic chanting was deafening now. I burst through a final narrow passage and into a vast cavernous chamber. The sight stole the breath from my lungs. The cavern was enormous, a natural dome deep within the mountain. In the center, standing in a circle of skulls, was Sterling Graves. Light streamed down from a fissure high in the cavern ceiling, the blood-red, apocalyptic light of the total lunar eclipse. It bathed him in a crimson glow. He was no longer entirely human. His body was contorting, bones snapping and reforming under his skin. His limbs elongated, his skin darkened and stretched, and his height increased with every passing second. The transformation, the final stage of the ritual, was upon him, and he turned his head, his eyes burning with red light, and looked directly at me. The transformation was an abomination of biology. Sterling Graves's body broke and remade itself. The sound of snapping bones and tearing ligaments, a wet, percussive accompaniment to the ritualistic chanting that still echoed from some unseen source. He grew, swelling with a dark, terrestrial power drawn from the earth beneath him. His skin became a dark, chitinous hide, like baked rock, and his form settled into something that was a nightmarish amalgamation of wolf, bear, and something older, something dug from the deepest, darkest corners of mythology. It stood easily 12 feet tall, a colossus of muscle and primal rage, its eyes burning with the crimson light of the eclipse. I raised the AR-10 and fired, emptying half the magazine in a controlled, rapid burst. The silver core bullets, which had torn the lesser werewolves apart, sparked and ricocheted off the creature's hide. A few dug in, leaving shallow, smoking wounds that began to close almost immediately, the flesh knitting itself back together with an audible hiss. It was like shooting at a bunker wall. The beast that was Graves let out a roar that was a physical force, shaking the dust from the cavern ceiling. It took a step toward me and the ground trembled. Just then, a figure stumbled into the cavern from the tunnel I had just used. It was Croft. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side, but he was alive. He saw the monster, saw my rifle fire having no effect, and his face hardened with a final, desperate resolve. "I'll draw its fire!" he yelled, his voice raw. He raised his shotgun and fired his last 2 shells at the creature's face. The blast of buckshot did nothing but annoy it, but it was enough. The monster's head turned toward the sheriff, momentarily distracted by the new nuisance. It ignored Croft. Its focus was entirely on me, the true threat. With a speed that defied its immense size, it lunged. I tried to backpedal, but it was useless. A single sweeping strike from its massive clawed hand connected with my rifle, shattering the weapon into a spray of plastic and steel. The force of the blow sent me flying backward, my body slamming into the cavern wall. The air left my lungs in a painful rush, and the world swam in a haze of black spots. I tasted blood. I lay there gasping, my ribs screaming in protest. The monster stalked toward me, taking its time now, savoring the victory. Its shadow fell over me, a promise of imminent, violent death. My primary weapon was gone. The mission was a failure. My hand, shaking and numb, scrabbled behind my back, my fingers fumbling for the familiar grip of the revolver. I found it. My fingers curled around the cold steel and wood. Croft, seeing my desperate move, knew what he had to do. He had one thing left. With his good hand, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the last block of dynamite, the fuse already sputtering. It wasn't enough to kill the beast, but it didn't have to be. "Hey, ugly!" he roared. With the last of his strength, he hurled the dynamite. It arced through the air and exploded harmlessly against the creature's thick leg. The blast was minuscule, a firecracker against a tank, but the flash and concussive force made the monster flinch. It turned its massive head toward the sheriff for a single fatal second, its eyes burning with irritation. That was all the time I needed. I dragged the huge Ruger Super Red Hawk free, the barrel feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Through a fog of pain, I raised it with both hands, the front sight wavering, and centered it on the creature's massive chest. This was it. The alpha and omega of my family's legacy. One shot. I squeezed the trigger. The revolver bucked in my hands with the force of a controlled explosion. The sound was not the sharp crack of a rifle, but a deep, resonant boom that dwarfed every other sound in the cavern. The single mythic bullet flew true. It struck the monster dead center in its sternum. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a point of pure silver-white light appeared where the bullet had entered. A network of brilliant silver cracks spread across the creature's chest, like lightning trapped under glass. The beast looked down at its own chest in what looked like confusion. It opened its mouth to roar, but only a choked, gurgling sound came out. Then, with a silent inward collapse, the internal detonation occurred. The consecrated silver, the mercury, the wolfsbane, they didn't just kill the flesh, they annihilated the spirit. A column of brilliant silver flame erupted from the creature's chest, punching out through its back. Its final, soundless scream was not of pain, but of utter oblivion. The colossal body, its unholy energy consumed from within, did not fall. It simply disintegrated, dissolving into a swirling cloud of black ash and fading red embers that drifted slowly to the cavern floor. With the Alpha's death, the ritual shattered. The psychic energy he had been gathering and commanding imploded, sending a silent, concussive shockwave through the pack's collective consciousness. The link was broken. All through the mines and the surrounding woods, the remaining werewolves felt their leader's spirit extinguish. The cold, calculating intelligence that guided them vanished, replaced by a flood of primal fear and animalistic panic. They were no longer a disciplined pack. They were just beasts, suddenly terrified and alone in the dark. They fled, scattering in every direction, their howls of rage turning into yelps of terror as they scrambled to escape the tainted ground. The dynasty of the Iron Ridge Pack was broken. In the cavern, silence reigned. The red light of the eclipse faded from the fissure above, replaced by the pale, clean light of the returning moon. The ashes of Sterling Graves settled on the floor. I pushed myself to my feet, my body a symphony of pain, and stumbled over to Croft. The sheriff was slumped against the wall, alive but barely. He had a piece of shrapnel in his leg, and his breathing was shallow, but his eyes were open, watching the last of the ash settle. "Did we?" he whispered. "We did," I said, helping him to his feet, draping his good arm over my shoulder. The journey out of the mines was a slow, agonizing ordeal. We emerged from the darkness into the cold, crisp air of a new day. The eclipse was over. The sun was rising, casting a hopeful golden light over the rugged peaks. The nightmare had passed. By mid-morning, the first units of the Montana State Police, responding to the cut communication lines, made their way into a devastated Arrowwood. Croft, leaning against the hood of his battered truck with me beside him, made the official report over a state trooper's radio. His voice was steady, authoritative. He told them the town had been attacked by a heavily armed and organized cult, the Children of Fenris. He said they had tracked them to their base in the old copper mines, where a firefight and the cult's own explosives had resulted in the complete neutralization of the threat. It was a clean, simple story, a story they could accept. A story, faced with a bizarre and horrific crime scene and desperate to avoid a nationwide panic, the state and federal authorities who descended on the town decided to embrace Croft's narrative. The incident at Arrowwood was officially classified as an act of domestic terrorism. The files were sealed, the town was locked down, and the truth was buried under a mountain of government paperwork. A few days later, I visited Croft in the makeshift field hospital set up in the town's high school gymnasium. He was sitting up in a cot, his leg in a cast, looking older and infinitely more tired. "The feds are swarming the place," he said, his voice low. "Asking questions I don't have real answers for." He looked at me. "You'll be going soon." It wasn't a question. I nodded. "Will you come back?" He started to ask. If something like this ever, you know how to find me." I cut him off softly. Our network was hidden, but for those who knew the truth, the channels were always open. We didn't shake hands. We didn't need to. We were two soldiers who had survived a battle no one else would ever know was fought. I walked out of the gymnasium, my own wounds stitched and bandaged, and got into my F-150. I drove out of Arrowwood before the first black sedans of the FBI arrived, just another shadow slipping away unnoticed. My mission here was done. Sheriff Warren Croft recovered. He became the guardian of Arrowwood's terrible secret, rebuilding his town piece by piece, his authority now unquestioned. But every night he would look up at the dark, silent ridges of the national park, a sentinel watching over a piece he knew was fragile. And somewhere out on the endless highways of America, I drove on, the last hunter of a dying line, my war continuing in the shadows, always one step ahead of the darkness, forever listening for the next whisper on the wire.